Hey everybody, thanks for joining me. Before we get started, tell me if this reverb out there is obnoxious. I try to put just a real basic plate reverb to kind of make this whole thing gel a little bit better at your end. And this is a Refend 59 Les Paul Junior double cut that's in for a semi-extended visit. Needs a little bit of setup work. You know, really do much up here. Not my junior, but there'll be videos on the. We'll be doing some stuff through some real amps. Right now, I'm trying Tonex. So this is a deluxe reverb sound, though I don't have the reverb turned on. A plate plug-in. Here's a steel string swinger 2-rock kind of thing. One pickup, just a tone and a volume. Yeah, I'm pretty hoarse, Travis. I'm getting over some yuck. Here's an HC30 matchless kind of thing. And the same thing with a bit more gain. And super really hard to get the levels to match in the Tonex for various reasons. Yeah, I forgot I have the guitar ducking my vocals, so some of the things I might have said there might not have come through. So, yeah, it's got well, Jim, the update that's going to give time-based effects is coming out in October. I don't know that it's come out yet. I saw a video that it is coming out, but it has not yet, as far as I know. If so, I'll have to go back and find it. I'm going to be using this in conjunction with the HX Stomp. So no, that was a deluxe model capture, a deluxe reverb capture in the Tonex. You know, if Tonex adds effects, it's going to make it really useful for people, but so far I have been very underwhelmed by the effects built in. The noise gate is just juvenile. It's so bad. Especially with P90s, it's really apparent. Let me put this to the side. The reverbs, it's got a usable plate and a usable room. The springs are absurdly bad. And the compressor is only useful in post and not very. So I'm going to be using the Tonex for what it's good at. But I'm going down a big rabbit hole with what the levels should be. And I have got them all dialed in. Unity gain, you know, so what goes into the plug-in in Logic is exactly the same level coming out of the guitar. But then all that stuff, and when you load it into the pedal, the levels go crazy. So it's gonna, I'm gonna get it solved. I'm gonna find what the solution is for everybody, because I've got signal generators and meters and all kinds of tools. But there's so much conflicting information out there. So for those of you who are in this game, I've got some captures from Jason Seditz and some captures from, what do they call themselves? Amaran Audio. Anyway, those are two of the most popular guys, and they have very different approaches to input level. One, Jason wants it at either 0 or -3. And the Amaran Audio guys want it like +8. And that's a big difference. And then the trouble is +8, what does 8 mean? It's not 8 dB. And the meters don't mean anything. So, no. Hey, Fountainberg, you know, this is the Chinese Pagani Design Speedmaster which works exactly the same as a Speedmaster, and no one can tell the difference from this far away, but it saved me about $7,000. So, I'm not going to be buying an Omega of that price. Anyway, we'll get more into the Tonex in a video on that later when I really know it and have solved all these issues. I'd rather come to you guys with solutions than problems. It is a very promising device. It's a very promising set of tools with the software version and the hardware version. And if I can get this thing working consistently where I know what all the levels are and how to, I know what to expect, then I can do captures of all the fantastic amps that come through here. So I've got like actual 65 deluxe reverb there. I've got an actual 58 bassman there. In the other room, I've got an actual 66 AC30, and I've had so many ones come through in the past, as you guys have seen. So it'd be really nice if this works for me to be able to do accurate captures, and I'd probably do one DI capture and one capture through the various speakers and cabs here with the Royer and the 57. I do like the idea of, in my experience, the DI captures are the best way to go because some of the cab models that these guys have are just crazy. Like the Amaran Audio Matchless HC30, no, not the Matchless HC30, their Vox cab. The Vox cab, for whatever reason, the way they mic that thing up, it has got so much sub bass. It is just boomy and useless. And I changed to a Yorkville Audio AC30 cab IR, and much, much better. So I'm persnickety. I have a feeling that I'll like my own captures much better than all these that you can download or buy. Anyway, that's a lot on a subject which is not near and dear to everyone's hearts here. So let me unplug from this. Let me mute the guitar, and on the vocal, turn off the gate as it's no longer necessary, and get this cable out of my way. If there's any point I need to show a guitar thing later, I'll plug it back in. And none of the sounds I've had here with the deluxe, the Dumble style, steel string, the matchless, the super lead, or the Friedman come close to what I've gotten in this room with the actual amps. But I suspect some of that is the guys doing the capturing. It's a little bit warm today. I'm going to turn on this fan. You guys tell me if it makes it too noisy. And point towards me, please. Sorry, I'm real high-tech here. It has to point away from me before it can point to me. Let me get up and start some of the questions you guys have been so good to ask and have now been waiting and waiting and waiting for. And again, to those of you who came here, who came earlier before the chat started and left a question, the first questions that pop up for me are not in sequence that they were left. So if I answer a question that was asked before yours, I will get to yours fairly shortly, and at some point, the sequence becomes correct. So we're starting with Dennis Rome, who's got a Blackheart Little Giant that went dead, doesn't power up. If this is something I would work on, probably would not be cost effective for me to work on it. How much do those cost? Like $200, and if you have a $200 repair, that is something that. It could be something very simple. It could be a power transformer. When you get into very low price amps like that, you get unreliable. They are essentially unreliable. They are essentially, you're just leasing them from the landfill for a while, and repair bills can exceed the cost, their value, used or new. And that's the problem with these things. It's probably something any tech could diagnose and fix, but is it a worthwhile investment? It depends. It could be you have one bad cap and it's easily changed, but you could also have something where that caught on fire and now it needs a heroic rescue. But I can't answer that from here. Hey Rob F, what are my thoughts about adding a top vent like a Vox atop a combo cab mono price over a circuit board, tube mounts as possible, extending component life by removing heat? Don't worry about it. That monoprice point of failure is not going to be heat so much. You can do it if you want. You want to carve up your monitor price. It's not going to do that much for you, though. Shaylin Wolf, 71 basement 50. Normal channel volume pot on 0 won't mute the signal. Swapped the V3 preamp tube and now it does. What causes this? DC leak? Yeah, I've run into this a lot, and I've actually shown videos on this. I'm not sure which ones. I can't point you directly to them on the channel, but there are tubes which I believe the issue is to the cathode. There's just not enough isolation from this triode's cathode to this triode's cathode, and there are two triodes in each 12X7, and so current present on one injects itself into the other one. So in a basement 50 or most fenders, the first triode is getting signal from the input jack, and then it is feeding out to the tone stack and then to a volume pot, and that volume pot's wiper is feeding the input of the second triode. And if that volume pot is turned down to 0, the grid of the second triode should have no signal, but signal can leak through the cathode of the first triode, and you still hear it. It depends on the layout, and I'm trying to remember on the basement 50, is V3 the preamp tube for the normal channel? Is V3 the phase inverter, in which case it can be an issue through the DC supply, which is less common. But yeah, I've noticed it's particularly bad with the Russian tubes. Not all Russian tubes do this, but Russian tubes do this in cases where JJ and Chinese and old tubes, pre-1980s, do not. As in, I have tried this with, like, here's a Tonex, here's Electroharmonics, both made in the same Russian factory. They both have this problem. No JJs have that problem. No TIDs or Schwagangs have that problem. No old RCAs or Emperexes I have around here have that problem. And then there'll be one Tonex that doesn't do that have that problem. It's maddening. Let's see. Heat dissipation is a big deal, but just adding an air vent won't necessarily increase that too much. You need to have a better airflow, and a lot of times it's still kind of a trapped box. And by the time the heat rises to that vent, it's already built up inside. It helps a little bit, probably not enough to be worth it. If a vent compromises the shielding of the circuit, a vent in a wooden cabinet will not compromise the shielding of the circuit whatsoever. A vent or a hole through a shielding material, in this case it could be foil on the top of a wooden cabinet, or it could be holes in a chassis for circulation. It's going to depend on the size of the hole, the size of the vent. At some point, it's just an open gap, but you have to go into Faraday design for this. There is a calculation for, any hole lessens the shielding effectiveness, but it has to get to a certain size before there's any measurable real-world impact in our case. Now, if you're designing a telecommunications satellite, millions of hertz of frequency, much faster, much higher frequency, ultra-high frequency stuff, then these things matter. For guitar amps, you'd have to have a hole the size of a Folgers can before you'd have any appreciable difference in shielding. That's a technical term we use, the size of a Folgers can. Now, Brad won't know what that is because Brad doesn't know about Folgers coffee. Poor Brad. And I'm sorry if I'm basso profundo. I've got a sore throat, and this is much more comfortable. If I talk up here, I'm going to hurt myself, so... Yeah, Alex, PRS amps are a very mixed bag. Now, I have seen photos of the HRDX20, and it looks quite good. I've not had one on the bench, so I cannot say that it's bad. I cannot say that it's good, but it looks good. The two-channel C and two-channel H's were terrible. The Archon amps have been horrible. And the Grissom, the DGT, the 30, I've not tried the new 15, the 30 was really well built. So, it's definitely worth playing and checking out. If it sounds good to you, They do have a pretty good warranty. I mean, they're a good company. I just find that their amps are hit and miss, and I don't understand why they are so drastically hit and miss, because when they hit, they hit. Hopefully on that one they hit. Merrill says, anyone notice that Lyle actually does sound like Harrison Ford if you A-B his voice with A New Hope? I know. I'm out of it for a little bit. Everyone gets delusions of grandeur. I don't think I sound like Harrison Ford. But if my wife thinks that, then so be it. To bus bar or to not bus bar the back of pots? That is the question. Do not. Is it just a stupid, terrible, no good, very bad idea? I've got a Marshall Bluesbreaker combo here that I've recorded the inside the champ video on, inside the chassis video on. I've just got to do a little playing video section to put it together, and that'll be discussing that. And in that video, there's going to be a link to my Marshall grounding video where I go through that. But basically, when you have all the pots with a bus bar tied to them, if there's nothing tied to those bus bars, that's fine. It's just a big redundant shield, doesn't do anything. But as soon as you're using that bus bar for signal grounds, then through that bus bar, there are multiple connections to chassis, and you get eddy currents and ground loops. And I've demonstrated before and after how drastically the noise level in an amp comes down when you don't use a bus bar. Now, that I'm talking about a bus bar like Marshall has done it. The other way to do it is what you see in Two Rock, and you see it in Dumble, and I think even Nick from Seriatone has done this on some of his builds, where you have a bus wire, either a very thick bus wire or twisted 18-gauge bus wires to make a thick bus wire, which runs close to the back of the pots, but it's not touching the pot shells, and it only goes to ground, only goes to chassis right by the input jacks, and then all the grounds connect to that in sequence. That is the correct way to do a bus wire, because you can connect all the grounds in circuit sequence from noisiest to quietest, and everything references to the chassis right by the input jack. So if you have to do a bus wire, that's the way to do that. And I've done that on some amps on the channel. I think on that Fender Concert 2 that I turned into a real amp, I did that because it was the easiest way to make everything work. Yeah, thank you, Merrill. Merrill's got that ground schemes video up. That's what I was talking about there, BC Electronics, and it really does work. Thank you, Tom. Appreciate that. Hey, Chris R. What are some things we as customers can do better to communicate with techs while dropping an amp off for service? Mods, do's and don'ts. Any common amp tech pet peeves? Well, number one, and this is going to sound like I'm just venting, I don't want to hear the life story. I don't have time to hear about how this guy in Florida used it with the Jimmy Jones band for 20 years, and his grandpa sold it to your second cousin, and it was sitting in an attic, and then you went over there. People love to talk about their amps, but the trouble is I do have a fixed amount of time during the day. And if it takes me 45 minutes to get past that to what's actually wrong with it, especially if it's in an email and it's like 3 pages of backstory, I'm sorry, your amp is not the Lord of the Rings. I need to get, skip to the punchline. Don't bore us, get to the chorus. Second of all, don't tell us what you think it is. Tell us what you've experienced. Don't tell me, hey, you read online you need these filter caps and transformers. Just say, hey, it started to hum real bad, or it started to make a real weird whoa, 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 whoa sound, and I turned it off, or some white smoke came out of it, or just it seems a little noisy, or I get a weird sound on certain notes. Describe things to us in musical terms. Don't try to diagnose, because what happens, and this seems like I'm being mean, is a lot of times owners think that they understand what's going on with the problem, and then they are unsatisfied with the solution, even if the solution solves the problem, because it can be it can be in their favor, and they can still be upset. I had a guy who just wanted new transformers and new caps because he had read on the gear page, and the amp came in, and I said, "Well, you're very lucky. This ground screw, which is how all the circuit grounds are made, was loose, and there had been some corrosion there on the screw and on that part of the PCB. So I took that screw out and I cleaned everything and I put it back together, and your amp is dead silent, working great. Well, I really think you ought to change out those tubes, or change out those caps or whatever." I'm like, "No, I can. It'd be easier if you just give me an extra $500 now and just take the amp." But people come to weird logical places. I'll put it that way. So just try to describe in a real world musician's experience what how the amp used to be and what it is, and also be honest. If the amp starts to hum terribly, and you tell me that it hums terribly, and I make it not hum terribly, but then I say, "Hey, the reverb tank is busted. It doesn't have any reverb." Don't lie to me and say it was working when I dropped it off, because we'll know. Be honest with people, and they'll be honest with you. Let's see. On the photo that Bambule, that is this Marshall Bluesbreaker, though 99% of the components have been replaced by moi. You'll see that video very soon, and it sounds fantastic. So I really like those little orange Vichets. They're made in the same factory that used to make them for Philips. Back when Philips did them, they were green. So anyone who's got an early 70s Marshall knows those green Philips caps. They're still being made today by Vichet. They're orange now. They sound right, and they fit in the little spaces. I'm not jamming Sozos or something. And, I'm not jamming a cap that big into a space that big with a lead that thick into a hole that thick. Yeah, you gotta when you mod an amp, the goal is to make it at least as good as it was when it left the factory. Better if you can. No cut traces unless it's really necessary. No super glue, no spaghetti going everywhere. I mean, that's like just my opinion, man, but hey, Fred. Fred's got a new twin reverb reissue that started to loudly pop and hiss after a few days, nothing plugged in. Did basic troubleshooting, tubes, etc. Returned and got a replacement that is doing the same thing. The two things I would want to know first are what your wall voltage actually is. Can you measure that? And whether your wall voltage actually has a good ground. Make sure that you're plugging into a good ground that is going to give you between 100 and 125 volts AC reliably, preferably around 117 to 120. If you don't have a good steady supply and you don't have a ground, it can be a hellish environment for the amp if you're getting 130 volts out of the wall and the bias goes out. But especially if you have two in a row, so I would take the amp to another location, take it to work, take it to your church, take it to a friend's house, whatever, see how it does there. Does it do the same thing? That probably rules out the electrical supply at your house. Twin reverb reissues are pretty good amps that are hampered by and large by loose hardware, as I've shown in my what owners can do for their Fender reissue amps videos. And the filter caps are not great, but the filter caps on a new amp should be okay for a good long while, like 2 years. It should be 15 to 20 years, but they're going to last 2 years typically. So it is unlikely that you have two new twin reverb reissues that both have bad filter caps out of the gate. Dale's Guitar Tuition, I appreciate the super chat. I will have thoughts on your question above when I get to your question above. I answer these in the order that they come in. So, and sometimes it takes a couple minutes, up to 30 minutes for me to get to one, depending on how many questions there are. But I will get to you. I do appreciate you being here, and I'm not chastising you. I haven't seen you here before, so I want you to know that I try to answer every question that gets asked, regardless of super chat status. But it takes me a while to get through them. So, Fred. Also, if you bought it from a dealer, take it to your dealer, plug it in there, let them go through it with you. Maybe it's something at your house. If not, you know, I used to do a lot of work for a local guitar store, and they'd have an amp that had a problem at home. Sometimes I couldn't replicate it, and sometimes I would say, "Hey, we're going to leave this on the showroom floor all day, every day." It would take 4 days before, oh yeah, it started making a sputtering sound. But not everything's easy to diagnose. But if it happens in front of the store owners, you're in a much better position to get help finding what the problem is. Do I have any opinions on Rift Amps UK, Frederico? Well, I don't have any opinions on the amps because I've not had one in front of me. I've not heard one. I've seen his work. He does excellent work. I like him. I like his ethos. I like his channel. So in a very general sense, I think the Rift Amps business and the Rift Amps channel is great. And I assume from everything I've seen that his amps should be very, very good. But I've not heard one or played one. So if you're out there, Mr. Rift, and you want to send one to me, I'd be delighted to kick the tires, put it through its paces, and give you a review. In which case, I'd be very able to answer that question at that point. But I don't think he needs my opinion. I think his opinion is every bit as good as mine. He knows what he's doing. It gets to a certain point where the quality is beyond what it needs to be acceptable. And anything beyond that is subjective preference. I mean, you may play that Rift and say, that's a really good amp. That is someone else's really good amp. For me, the Friedman works better. Or vice versa. It's like Paul Reed Smith guitars are fantastic guitars. None of the ones I've ever played have wanted to be my guitar. And it's not that I'm being some snob because 59 Juniors don't come in very often. This is not mine, but I'm glad to have it here visiting. But it has a much better neck than any PRS I've played, with the exception of one old Rosewood McCarty that had a really nice neck. I couldn't afford the price of that one's admission. It had an ugly over the top. It was like the figure looked like something meant from Marie Antoinette's dresser. I don't have an outfit that would match that guitar. And I do like the neck on the DGT SEs a lot. I might pick one of those up one day. It's not quite as nice as a 59 Junior, but it's not too far from the ballpark. Anyway, I got sidetracked. Hey, Maddie B. I think this was the first question asked. Sorry if it took me a while to get to it because, like I said, the sequence comes and changes when it goes live. I think you mean a Traynor YCV40. Bad news, I don't have any experience with either a Traylor or a Traynor. I am Traynor YCV40. I have no familiarity with it. The trainers that I have spent most of the time with have been late 60s and 70s. And so I can tell you about YBA2 Bassmasters, but I can't tell you about a YCV40. But hey, if you love it, great, and hopefully it's reliable for you. I have found that most experienced trainer techs, live a good deal north of Memphis. So try the Toronto area. Let's see. Just drive Sheboygan Falls. I am still trying to get through my emails. If you've emailed me, I will get to you. I promise. I would love to work on your 63 Blackface Deluxe. I've got one in the other room right now, but it's a 64. If you've got a 63, that would be a real rare. That's a hen's tooth. Why did Fender switch from a 5Y3 on the Brown panel Princeton to GZ34 on the Princeton AA964? It seems like the voltage exceeds max value for 6v6 plate and screen grid. Yeah, it does. But there's what the data sheet... It's a case-by-case basis. In general, you should adhere to the data sheet or take it seriously into account. But most deluxe reverbs and most post-63, actually post-64, Princetons ignore that and just, we're running at 420 plate up to 440, 450 plate and up to 440 screen. way above the rating of a 6v6, and they tended to last. Now, on that note, there are balances. You can bias it hotter, which brings the B plus down. You can bias it cooler, which brings the B plus up. You got to find the sweet spot on those things. I like them about 55-60% dissipation on a deluxe. That way, the B plus is brought down a good amount, but you're not running the tube really, really hot, and that balance seems to work. Fender would also use 40 microfarad filtering on a Princeton, not a Princeton, a Champ, like on a 5Y3, which has got a max capacitance of about 30. So Fender bent the rules. Sometimes they got away with it, sometimes they didn't. When it comes to the GZ34, they wanted the amps to be louder and to have a higher B plus in order to get more output from the 6v6s, and they had to go to the GZ34 to do that. It's got a lot more voltage output and can handle more voltage and more current than a 5Y3. And if you wanted to make your Princeton run a little bit cooler, I think you can get away with. You can get away with, because the 70s ones have the same power transformer. You can use a 5U4 GB instead of a GZ34, and you'll get about a 30 volt B plus drop. I'm glad the reverb sounded good out there, better than my voice, certainly. I never know how it's going to translate on the other end, because if I was hearing the guitar dry, because I don't have any of the effects turned on to this, and so the plug-in is only feeding the output of Logic, which is going to this program, but I'm not hearing the output of Logic. Otherwise, I'd have my voice coming back at me 20 milliseconds, 40 milliseconds later, and I'd be in Chewbacca in Cloud City with sonic torture. So I'm not hearing the reverb, I'm just hearing the dry guitar. Let's see. How does speaker impedance affect tone? Would an 8-ohm speaker plugged into the 8-ohm jack sound any different than the same speaker at 16 ohms plugged into the 16-ohm jack? No. You would hear the same thing if the output transformer is good quality. The only exception to that would be some amps where they have some amps have that whole circuit miswired, and they'll have an impedance selector switch, and they will connect the negative feedback tap to the common of that switch rather than to a fixed tap on the transformer. So as you go from 4 to 8 to 16, the amp has wildly different levels of negative feedback happening. And the better way to do it is to say, all right, we're going to do our calculations using the 8-ohm tap, and the negative feedback is always going to 8, even if we feed the speakers 4, 8, or 16. So in an amp where the negative feedback is done correctly, and it's a high-quality transformer, you're not going to hear the difference going 16 ohms into 16-ohm speaker versus 8 ohms into 8-ohm speaker. Now, this is also assuming that all the speakers are so close in sound to each other that they're indistinguishable. There are variations from speaker to speaker, the same make model, off the same line on the same day. So it's possible that you would do that experiment and you say, well, this one's a lot brighter, or this one's got a weird mid thing. That's going to be the speaker, not the impedance thing most of the time, unless you've got a problem with your output transformer. And yeah, hey Jim, I'll check after this and see if that update has posted for Tonex. But I opened the Tonex app this morning and it didn't tell me about an update. But I'd be curious to see if they can make some of the time-based effects sound good. So far, their spring reverbs are a terrible, terrible joke. Matt Johnson, Jesus. Yeah, we've been watching, it is just so horrible what's been going on for you guys. I'm glad you have power. I hope you have not lost anyone or anything, crucial. Everyone loses things like in this situation, but I hope you and all yours are safe. We were in Asheville not long ago, and it's just been devastating watching the destruction. And I feel for everyone from Florida, Georgia, and the Carolinas, everyone affected. It's just the worst case scenario for so many of those communities, especially the ones higher up in the mountains where they're literally having to use mule trains to bring them supplies because the roads are all washed out. And for various reasons, they can't even get helicopters to all areas. But everyone out there is trying their hardest. I'm glad you're able to hear us. I hope you are okay. Thank you, Matt. Hey, Jay Rosales. The difference between a 6L6 and EL34 tube, boy, that is either a very short answer or a very, very long answer. So I'm going to go with the short one because we've got a lot of questions to get to. In general, they are almost interchangeable as far as the circuit goes. There are niceties you can do. You may prefer to have a little more of screen current reduction on an EL34. But you can put 34s or 6L6s or KT6s in a Baseman or a Twin or a Marshall 100-watt or a Blues Breaker JTM45 like this, if you then adjust the bias and the bias circuit of the amp has the proper range to allow that. Where it gets a little more complicated, let me close this so I stop looking at myself. Where it gets a little more complicated is the primary impedance of the output transformer. Different output tubes have a different primary impedance that they operate best at or want to see. So you may have a pair of 6L6s that want to see 6 ohms, and the others want to see, 6K, not 6 ohms, and the 34s prefer to see 4K. So while it's electronically safe to use either in the circuit, if you make sure that they bias, you will get very different sounds because one of them is going to have the optimal output transformer primary, the other one's not. That said, what is optimal on paper is not always preferential because it gets into the subjective. You might like the sound of 34 with the wrong load on it. But the other thing you have to look at is an EL34, I think, draws more current than a 6L6. I don't have time to look that up. But you have to be careful when you change output to power types because some draw more heat or current than others. Yeah, let's get on to the next one. But there are lots of videos and articles on the internet about this. Yeah, Asheville basically gone, Matt. It's just incredible. So everyone, you guys, you do not need to give me any super chats today. Anything that you would be inclined to give here, go donate to, send bottled water there. I don't know who to send you to, but there are lots of organizations. They need food, they need water. Find someone reputable. I have suspicions the Red Cross is not always the most efficient use of monies, but help people out in this situation if you can. Hey, Martin Reed, are multi-channel amps necessary when you can do so much with pedals? Is there origin from when 2 or more musicians plugged into one amp? Well, there are 2 variations on multi-channel amps. You've got that Bassman over there, 58 Bassman, and 65 Deluxe Reverb, and this Marshall, each of which has 4 inputs. So, they're multi-channel. Each of them has 2 channels. Well, the Bassman's got 2 inputs with 2 volumes and then 1 tone stack. The Deluxe Reverb's got 2 separate channels, and then this one is done like the Bassman. So you have 4 inputs with 2 volumes. You could run 2 to 4 instruments at once to that. So that's one level of a multi-channel amp. And it was not uncommon for someone to have the bass. Look at the old Fender amps with 3 inputs. One guy would have the guitar, there'd be the bass, and then the vocal mic would be into one of that, or the pedal steel and the accordion, whatever. So that's the old way to do it. But currently, most people, when they think of multi-channel amps, are you have one input, and there are like a Mesa or a Sur, where you might have a green channel, a blue channel, and a red channel, and they all have different levels of gain with individual gain and volume controls, individual tone stacks, even preferably individual tone stacks. So I think that's probably more what you're talking about in terms of when you can do so much with pedals. Uh, People prefer to have, here's my clean channel, here's my crunch channel, my drive channel. And it's a different sound than pedals. If I plug the Strat with humbuckers into a Friedman, that's a very different high gain sound than if I plug the same Strat with the same humbucker through a Boss Metal Zone or a Big Muff into a Twin, even though they're both, very high gain, saturated sounds. I tend to prefer the sound of the amplifier to the pedal, but I tend to prefer discrete amplifiers. So I'm not looking for one amp to give me everything. I'd rather say, I'm gonna have a Twin for my cleans, and I'm gonna have an AC30 or a JTM45 for my crunch, and then I'll go into something higher gain. And then if I'm using pedals on top of that, it's a color, like a fuzz does something that no amp can do. And they can be fun in conjunction. But, it gets very subjective. But I think we need to separate channel changing amps from multi-channel amps somehow. But that'd be a different long subject. Hey, Anthony Vianney, I have no opinion on Boss's Next Tone series, including the special, because I have not read or seen or heard anything about it. But I'll check it out. Maybe I'll have a better answer for you at some point. But it's so hard to keep up with everything on the market these days. Any thoughts on the Ampeg V4 100-watt guitar amp with reverb? Yes. My thoughts are, Keith Richards used a V4 and a V2 on the Stones US tour in like 74 or 76. Keith Richards is a little bitty, a wispy, thin guy, and he had great big roadies. So if you are a small person, much like Mr. Richards, and you do not have the roadies, you probably won't want that big behemoth. It is one of the heaviest guitar amps ever made. It's not much lighter than an SVT, and it has a lot of the same construction problems as an SVT. It's got PCBs, which are real prone to wires breaking, bad solder joints. Diodes love to burn up in those things, and the dropping resistors like to burn the boards in those things. And they have some problems in the V4 with the bias supply being inadequate to the task. So they are fantastic amps if you can afford to do the care and feeding, and they're fantastic amps if you have someone else carrying them for you. For most people, on most stages these days where you cannot be Keith Richards in a Coliseum in 1974 loud, they're a bit much. I'll just say that. 68 Super Reverb, new to you, Oliver. Opened it up, and bias board has been moved and mounted parallel to the main board, just to the left of it. Is that common? Not in a 68, should not be. Do you see like two holes and maybe a square patch where the metal surface right to the right of the power jewel is behind the logo, where the bias board definitely used to be, where the silver's the metal chassis newer in a square and then has wear on the outside. It's possible that they put it there in 68, but it'd be uncommon. I've not run into it in 68. In later 70s, they started moving it because they went to not having a choke. They started moving it between the power transformer and the main board. But it's possible that it's factory, but there's no necessary reason it can't be to the left of the main board in a 68. Electronically, it's fine. But I don't know if it's original and why it would have been moved. Just a second. I've got this thing going on. I'm going to mute myself and snort. That's for the guy who's complaining that I slurp my coffee too loud. If you think the coffee's bad, let's see. Hey, Fred. Yeah, I'm trying very hard to stay current with all the digital stuff because I can see the writing on the wall, and I want to be able to continue to be some kind of resource for people, even if 90% of the people go digital and it's just people with their Rolexes and their Fenders. I'd love to. If that's the case, I'll charge more for the old amps. But if it's also a point where I could be a consultant on things like this, I'm just trying to stay current. So far, the amp modeling and the amp capturing is very good, with some exceptions for the fractal stuff. It's not very close to the real deal, even if you listen back at it like 95 dB, because I've done that test. There are so many factors that the measurements don't take into account. They're getting there. They will get there eventually. They're not quite there yet. And I don't think all the fractal stuff is necessarily very good at sounding like an amp in the room. A lot of times the fractal stuff sounds like the amp on a mixed and mastered record, which is cool. It's a sugar rush, but it's not quite the same thing. Let's see. Do amps use a lot of electricity? My bill has been oddly high. I wonder if it's because my amp is on for 6 hours a day. Amp question is AC10C1. Appreciate you. Well, there are labels on the back of most amps saying what the current draw is, what the amperage is. And yeah, it can add up. These things do not get that green energy seal of approval like a new refrigerator or dishwasher can. They're not Energy Star compliant. So if you're just leaving it on 6 hours a day, first of all, you are going to have a higher utility bill. Second of all, especially in the case of an AC10C1, you're asking for trouble. Try to keep that thing on only when you're playing it, because heat is not its friend, and the longer it's on, the more heat will build up. So guitar amplifiers are inefficient electrical devices. When you feel all that heat coming off things, all that heat is energy that's not making things loud. They're archaic, terrible things. So it's a trade-off. I'm going to have a slightly higher utility bill if I leave my amp on a lot, but it's if it's totally worth it to you. But it's not going to be like, oh my God, it's $400 higher because I left an AC10 on. But yeah, it does contribute. And if you have a lot of amps and you leave them all on at once, you're going to have a even higher utility bill. But it's not enough to stop using amps. But it's just fine to say, all right, I'll leave it on for 3 hours, no problem. But I don't need to leave it on for 6. If you're playing for 6 hours, play it for 6 hours. Thank you, Goody Guitars. Appreciate that. Very kind of you. Dr. Paul is building an EF86 channel AC15 clone. Is a Celestion Alnico Blue. Alnico is still the way to go. It is one of the classic ways to go. When I've got some videos up of the Excalibur 15, which is a similar amp I built, showing the Celestion Blue and the I think some ceramic speakers as well, and the Warehouse Black and Blue, which is also a very nice choice. But all that gets subjective. It's all up to you. But yeah, a good Alnico Blue 15 watt is the classic pairing, and still is a fantastic choice. It's just not the only fantastic choice these days. I have no thoughts on rev amps yet, man or face, because I've not been inside one. I've not seen one. I've not even heard one in person. I hope that they are fantastic, but until I get one on the bench, I don't have an opinion. For guitar cleansing, opinion on Tweed Pro 15-inch, rather 15-inch for guitar cleansing. Hopefully you mean playing. Did Amnesia. I'm not a big fan of the Tweed Pro. Tweed Pro is oddly anemic amp. It doesn't have a lot of doesn't have a lot of grit. It's pretty sounding, but it also doesn't have a lot of sparkle. It's kind of a the Tweed Pros to me are kind of inert. I prefer many other things, and to me, this may seem, unless you're chasing vintage correctness, in which case go find one of the various Fender models that had a 15-inch speaker. I think we have a lot of opportunities to increase our tonal palette, like have any amp that you like the sound of, and you know that the impedance options are for the output. You can get a cab made. You can buy a 1x15 cab with any speaker you want, and connect it to that. Then you have that sound of that amp through a 15-inch, sound of that amp through a 2x12, sound of that amp through a 2x15 if you want. It depends on how much money you have and space for things. But you don't need to buy an amp, a combo with a 15-inch speaker if you already have an amp that you like the sound of. But you may play an old 58 Tweed Pro with a 15-inch and think that guy on that YouTube thing's nuts. This is the best sound I've ever heard. I just think they're kind of anemic as the pros go. Just drive Sheboygan Falls. Yeah, you can jumper the channels on the non-reverb deluxe, because the channels you can jumper the channels on the reverb versions too, but they're gonna be partially out of phase, so you're gonna get weird frequency cancellations. But on the 63 non-reverb deluxe, if you jumper the channels, you get additive gain like you get on a Marshall or a J1045 or a 58 Bassman. It won't have the same amount of gain, but it has quite a bit. But yeah, you won't have any phase cancellations. Go for it. Hey, Sean has got a Marshall DSL 40C so far in 5 years. No issues. Good. That's one of the ones I recommend for that price point. It came with a 7080 speaker, of course, but I kind of recommend a better speaker. I do blues and rock and country. Yeah, I bet you'd be thrilled with a WGS Warehouse Guitar Speakers ET65 or a Veteran 30, or if you want to get the Celestion versions of similar speakers, the Creamback 65 or the Vintage 30. All those things would be fantastic pairings for a DSL 40C, because they're going to cover the cleans, the mid-gain crunch stuff, and the more lead tones that that amp does, and they're going to do it very well. So I think all those are better than the 7080. What did I say? I don't remember. Did I Shaolin. What did I say? Did I say Shaolin? I'm sorry. Made it rhyme with violin. Remember, I said I'm a little under the weather. Shaolin. We turned the frame rate crazy on the camera. We'll do that again. I'm feeling tired. Maybe tonight I'll just order a pizza and watch Kung Fu Hustle. That'd be awesome. Hey, thanks, Alex2112. Appreciate that. My favorite old school Rush album, probably Hemispheres. I divide old school, before Moving Pictures. Moving Pictures is the beginning of the new school. A little bit, there's a little bit of a crossover there on Permanent Waves, because some of the stuff ties into the stuff they're going to do in the early 80s. Some of the stuff is still coming from the 70s, like Jacob's Ladder. But Spirit Radio is definitely looking forward. But I think Hemispheres, followed by Farewell to Kings. Those are my choices. But first of all, Hemispheres, because it is amazing from start to finish and has fantastic sounds. And some of the 80s albums, the sounds aren't as good. And I'm not saying because of chorus or because of keyboards, but a lot of the, starting with Grace Under Pressure, they were mixed and mastered so thin in comparison to their contemporaries. I don't think that Rush got the, I know for a fact they weren't taken as seriously by the record company as other bands, which was good in a way in that they were left more to their own devices. But, their stuff wasn't being sent out to Bob Clearmountain. So you listen to a Rush album compared to what was getting the money from the record companies, and the albums are much smaller sounding. When you listen to them by themselves, they sound fine. Small in comparison to what. But I really wish that they had been mixed and mastered better. But I don't find that to be the case on the earlier, simpler albums, because it was a three-piece with, maybe four instruments happening at once, if you include the synths. And the synthesizers around the time of Hemispheres were so organic and thick and, thick and rich and chocolatey. And I hope you're not angered by my choice. It is not Caressive Steel. Oh, I don't want anyone to drink Folgers, Dustin, but it's nice to know what a Folgers can is as far as a size standard. Hey, Jebby Man, Jebby. Yeah, how I implemented the triode pentode switch on Keith's GA40 clone. Yeah, you can see that in the video on that, and you'll probably hear it. Keith's got that amp back now, and he really likes it. Anyway, the V1, both V1 and V2 in the GA40 are pentodes, or 5789 pentodes. And I tried this trick on V2, but when it's in triode mode, it has too little gain. The channel sounds good, but you lose the tremolo entirely. So I only implemented this on V1, which has a lot more gain than V2 because it doesn't have the tremolo insertion loss. And you can, if you look up the schematic for the Vox AC15 hand-wired, not AC15 hand-wired, Heritage, the AC15 Heritage amp the Vox had out, they show this. Basically, there are, let's try to do this without diagrams or anything. All right, so you have let's do it from this direction. So you have the the plate connection going to the plate of the tube. And normally you have, from that same plate connection, there's a 100K resistor or 220K resistor going to the B plus node. That B plus node will then go through typically a 1 meg resistor, in this case on the GA40 is like 750K, to the screen of that pentode, because pentode preamp tubes have a screen node. And from that screen, there'll be a capacitor to either to cathode or to ground. It should be to cathode. Most amp companies, including Gibson, just did it to ground. I think it was a 100 nanofarad, or might have been a 47 nanofarad on Keith's GA40. I don't remember what. So anyway, you've got 100K from B plus to the plate, and the plate goes out and feeds a couple of cap, which feeds the next stage. You've got 1 meg from B plus to the screen, and the screen also goes through a capacitor to ground. And to implement what I did is you always have the 1 meg feeding the cap to ground, but the junction of that goes to a switch, and the plate goes to a switch, and the center of that switch is the screen of the preamp tubes. So in one position, the screen is connected to the junction of the 1 meg resistor and the cap to ground. So it's a normal pentode operation. You have a separation between the plate voltage and the screen voltage, and only the plate feeds the next stage. But if you instead connect the screen to the plate, all of a sudden it forces the tube to go into triode mode operation. It has like 40% less gain. That's top of my head. And it may be slightly different than that, but it's a tremendous gain difference without neutering it. The trouble is there's no way to do that without a pop, unless you were to, I could install a low voltage supply with a muting circuit, with op amp, with opto isolators, or just with some JFET things, at the moment that's switching, before the switching happens, you mute the output, and then you lift the mute after the switching happens. And that would have been a very expensive change to make. Vox didn't make that, do a muting switch. 65 amps did the same kind of thing in one of their amps. They didn't do a muting switch. You just, hey, you've got this choice or this choice. If you do it on stage, put it in standby, or turn down the master before you switch it. Otherwise, everyone will hear a big pop. But it's cool. It was a nice way to make that channel so much more flexible and useful at the cost of one $4 switch. And it's easy, there's absolutely no sacrifice. When it's in pentode mode, it is 100% exactly in pentode mode as the old GA40s were. I think we're going to take a first 7-minute break, and we'll get to Fountain Bird's question. about his interesting preamp pedal. So that'll be fun. We'll do that in about 7 minutes. And see you then. I'm going to turn on my timer. All right, welcome back from first of two intermissions, and thought you might want to hear what a quieter guitar sounds like through that rig. That old Junior is fantastic, but that P90 has got some noise. Still not as alive as a real one, but I have to remind myself that some of that is because I'm listening at like 60 dB here versus minimum 85 through a real deluxe reverb on 3. So I'm gonna have to do more testing. So much of I talked about this poorly in my Let's Make It a video, and I want to revisit this at some point, maybe in a dedicated video, about adding compression to things, and not a compressor pedal in front of an amp, but adding really intentionally applied good studio compression to things, both recorded with real mics, like that 68 Twin with the Royer in that video, or in this case, Tonex. Because when we hear a deluxe reverb on 3.5 or 4, our ears don't hear those loud sounds linearly. Our ears add distortion artifacts. Our ears add compression artifacts. So if I record that accurately with a Royer and then play it back, and you're listening to it at 60, 70 dB, conversation level, it can be the exact same sound that was coming out of the speaker, but it is not making our ears compress. It's not making our ears add nonlinear distortions. So we don't hear it as being the same, and we don't hear it as being real or particularly interesting. So if you're very careful in adding a bit of the compression, and sometimes, typically people do this with old tape machines, but you can do that in plugins now, adding a little bit of very subtle distortion artifacts and compression. We hear it, and we hear that as, hey, that thing is compressed, and that thing has got some interesting harmonic things happening. That sounds loud. So even listening back at conversation level, it sounds more real to us, because that's how we hear the amp in the room. And that, I'm not even talking about a 100-watt Marshall. I'm talking about a deluxe reverb on 3. It's a really deep subject, and I'm trying to get my gear to the point where I can have that kind of presentation to you guys, where I can say, hey, here's what the mic heard, and here's push this button, and this is closer to how it sounds in the room at volume. And I don't know how well I'll be able to explain that to people. I am not a professor of, if you were to go take a recording engineer class, and someone who has taught this for 40 years will be better able to explain it than I am. It's also the fact that, they'll take 45 minutes in a class to discuss this, and they've got all the graphs, and I'll probably be trying to get this across in a 10-minute video. So I don't know if I'm the right messenger, but I'm going to give it a shot. Fountain Bird just got an interesting preamp pedal. I'm trying to decide if it should go in front or in the effects loop. Help you wrap your head around it. Should I just try both, let the ears decide? You should let the ears decide. Preamp pedals typically are going to give you the most benefit in front of an amplifier. Just a second, I've got a dry, yucky thing on my eyebrow. I don't want to be gross to you guys. Right back. Now I'm beautiful. So a preamp pedal is usually designed to sculpt and drive the preamp of an amplifier, or to replace the preamp of an amplifier. So you can also run it in the effects, and you may find a new application that you love in the effects loop. You can also put it in the effects, run into the preamp pedal, and then go from that to the effects return of your amplifier and bypass whatever effect preamplifier you have in the amplifier. It gets very confusing talking about this, and that will give you yet another sound to play around with. So, as long as as long as you don't catch anything on fire, have fun with it. Find what works for you. Yeah, I do. I love 2112 when I'm in the right mood, Alex. But mostly, my ears start to really get more interested for hemispheres. And C128D is asking about guitar shielding. Do I have a preference using appropriate tape or paint? Any specific brand that I recommend? Well, it's frustrating. StewMac makes really good products. StewMac has insanely high shipping costs unless you are a member, which costs quite a bit of money. But at that point, the shipping comes down. So it depends how often you're going to be ordering stuff. There are a lot of shielding paint guys on Reverb and eBay and stuff, and you never quite know what you're going to get. The StewMac paint is quite good, but it really needs to be shaken quite a bit because it will settle. I will often take mine to the local paint store and ask them to pretty please put it in their shaking machine because that thing does a better job in 5 minutes than I can in 5 hours. My preference is for shielding paint because you can be more thorough and it cannot come loose or come off unless you have to make a concerted effort to. But it takes longer. You got to do multiple coats, 24 hours between coats at least. So it's a time process. Shielding tape, good copper foil tape, is much faster, and it's removable, and you can put it in a vintage instrument and it comes right out cleanly. So that it has its own benefits, and you only do it once, and you're done. You don't have to do multiple layers. And I have done both. I find that you get as far as a meter tells you, you have more continuity with copper than you do with paint. You'll have 0 ohms with copper, and you may have 40 ohms with a good painted job. But you don't have to have perfect continuity to have good shielding. It is not acting as a ground. It is acting as a shield. Whichever way you do it, the most important thing is how well you use that material. And there may be some other brands that are also great, but I typically just go with whatever StewMac sells because I know it's going to be, if it wasn't good, they would change it out. Let's see. No, there's no reservations to get stuff from Hoffman. The turrets he uses are quite good. The issue with any turrets, and this is probably what's happening to Doug's stuff, is that guys who have underpowered soldering irons cannot heat up a turret well enough for it to flow solder or to tin properly. He used pre-tinned turrets, but a turret is a fairly large piece of metal compared to the size of a soldering iron tip. So if you're using the wrong tip or an underpowered iron, it can be very difficult. I've used Hoffman's turrets in a lot of my custom stuff and had no problems themselves. And if you can do the DIY layout program that Doug recommends, it is much faster to get him to make a board for you because he's got it all done on a CNC. But if you want to drill and stake yourself, go for it. Out of all the boards I've had from Doug, I've had one semi-loose turret that I had to restake. One of the tricks I do for Doug's boards, since he only offers so many services, is where I know I want standoffs to go, where I know I'm going to mount the board to the chassis. I'll have him put turrets there, and then I'll remove those turrets. Then I enlarge the hole to 1/8 of an inch, and then I've got a CNC located hole in the board for my standoffs to go. But no, Doug does great work. Let's see, people talking about whiskey and coffee. I prefer just coffee and coffee. Let's see. Who is a good capacitor supplier, and when replacing them, does the values have to be identical? If you're asking that question, you should always use identical values, with the exception that if you have an old amp which has a 25 microfarad cap in there, the modern version is 22. If you have an old one that says 50 microfarad, the modern version is 47, and you'll hear no difference. As you do this later, you'll know when and you may want to change the capacitance, or when you can say, well, this was 63 volts, but I would rather use 100, or this was a 63 volt, but I measured what's on there, what's ever going to be on there, I can get away with a 25. That's beyond the scope of answering this kind of format, this kind of form. So when you first start, replace like for like, as long as you know that an old 50 microfarad is a 47 microfarad today, 25 is a 22, etc. As far as good capacitor supplier, most guitar amp builders are going to be fine getting everything from tubesandmore.com, antiqueselectronics.com, or as if you're in the business, it's called cedistribution.com. It's the same business with two different pricing tiers. You can also get 90% of what you would need from Tube Depot. You can get a lot of what you would need from Mojo Tone. But as far as almost everything in one place, Antique Electronics, tubesandmore.com is probably the best bet for the average builder or wannabe builder. And they even have the really nice Vichy axials that I love. Myself, I get stuff from other vendors because I can get things in bulk prices at different prices. But I also know a lot more about what I'm looking for and why than the average person trying to build a kit. So for the average person building a kit, Hoffman Amps and tubesandmore.com are going to be great places. Let's see. Hey, Oliver, you're sneaking as many questions as you wish, and I will try to answer them. I just swapped in a TAD reverb tank. Is all that was in stock here. Are they the real deal or snake oil? Seeing mixed opinions. The TAD tanks are the same tanks sold as Mojo Tone and Ruby and MOD to an extent. They are all made in the same factory using the same core components. I don't know how much variation there is. I know that Mojo Tone's tanks have a slightly different specification for the inductors, and they have a slightly different sound than the equivalent spec MODs. But in my experience, MOD, Ruby, and TAD are all equivalent, and they're probably made in the same factory by the same company, and just they get different stickers and sent to different distributors to be sold as different products. And Mojo Tone seems to be using that same factory just with a slightly different set of specs. And all of them are infinitely better than what's being sold these days by Accutronics, which is sad because Accutronics used to be just among the best of the best, unless you could get the made exclusively in our air-conditioned factory by beautiful girls tanks. But that's not going to come back. Let's see. Good news, Mark Spurgeon. I'm glad you're going to get some progress and get some relief. I hate that you've been suffering that for a long, long time. Dale's guitar tuition. I mentioned that this small Super Reverb amp wasn't made well. Was that not made well because there are no vents for the heat? No, because it has crappy tube sockets. It was never fully assembled from the factory, and that the input and output jacks are always loose. The failure mode it has is a failure mode it should not have had. It's put it this way. It's really, really rare for me to find a Fender Champ from the 60s to now, from the 50s to now, where the under normal playing use, the cathode bypass cap in the output section exploded. And I'm not talking about, it was 70 years old and it blew up. I'm talking about, hey, this thing was changed out 5 years ago and it blew up. So that's a catastrophic failure. That does not happen very often with higher quality amps. And if the Fender Champ is the high quality level you're comparing it to, that tells us how far down we've come. It might be a problem with a cheap socket. I don't know yet. It's certainly a problem with that Pisvane kind of fake 6v6. It's the cheapest of the cheap. And and the trouble is, if the cathode cap blows up in a Champ, you open it up, it's right there. You change out one component. You don't have to take the entire amp apart. You have essentially a 20-minute fix for the cost of one capacitor. I got that amp was never registered. That Supro here was never registered under warranty. So I've got to do the repair on it. In order to change out one resistor and one capacitor, I've got to take the amp completely apart, take everything out of the amp. So like 2 to 3 hours labor to change two little tiny parts on an amp that's worth, they charge like $800-900. It's not going to be worth that with depreciation. And there's no guarantee that 6 months from now I won't have to do something else. Or will those tube sockets fail? Those are cheap plastic imitation tube sockets for the preamps. And those octal sockets, the ceramic octal sockets that Supro uses, I've had crack repeatedly on Supros in the last 10 years. So it has nothing to do with vents. It has to do with they saved the wrong pennies. It is built like a $200 amp, but they're selling it for like $800-900. So you do, as a consumer, with that information as you wish. Hey, Chris McKinney. Yeah, it's possible to see white noise and hiss on a scope, but you can, I don't know what scope you have or how to tell you how to do it, but if you can hear the white noise and hiss, then you don't necessarily need to scope it. But it is a frequency band, and a scope will measure it just fine. But the settings are going to depend on your scope. I have no. Hey, thank you very much, any major dude. I have no thoughts on Amplified Nation amps, as the only thing I know about them was watching about half of an interview the guy from Amplified Nation did. People seem to like them, but I don't know how well they're built or if they sound right or anything. So if I get one in, I will have an opinion. Until then, I don't like to speculate. I like to talk about what I know. And sometimes that's, hey, this Supro is built amazingly cheaply and will bite you in the butt. Or sometimes it's, hey, for the same price as this Supro, you could go buy a used Swart Atomic Space Tone, have the same 5-watt output, and have an incredibly built, fantastic sounding amp that should potentially last 40 years. It needs some filter caps in 15, 20, but other than that thing can be kept going. It could be a legacy amp the same way that 65 Deluxe Reverb is still working. So, sorry about the nose thing. I can't do much about it. Hey, Mickey in Norway, thank you very much. JCM 2000 TSL 100 with early PCB, crackling noise from preamp, no problem with plugging in effects return, no burn marks near power tubes. Can PCB issue affect the preamp? Yeah, it can. The power supply is on that main board, even if you're passing through the preamp is still driving power from the power supply. And so you can have, people think that the only issue with the early JCM 2000 boards is leakage in the bias on the output tubes. Now that's where it first shows up typically, but you can have leakage anywhere in that PCB. But it's not necessarily that. The first thing I would look at if I had a crackling noise in a JCM 2000, TSL 100, DSL 100, whichever version, or the 110, is I would remove all the knobs and all the pots and the jacks, and I would pull the preamp board out and look on the underneath, and I bet I would find one or more broken solder joints that because the pot is suspended. I'm sorry, the board is suspended by the pots sticking out through the chassis. If any of that hardware gets loose, then all of a sudden you've got that happening at the pot and the board, and that strains those solder joints, and the solder joints crack, and when that happens, you get crackling. So, do that. Make sure all the solder joints look good. Make sure all your tube sockets are clean. Just flush them with isopropyl alcohol. It can be like 91%. It doesn't have to be medical grade. You can get it here in the United States, we can get it at drugstores. And it's mostly called isopropyl alcohol. It's also called isopropanol in different countries. This is like $5 at Walgreens, and it works just fine for our purposes. I don't know what you have in Norway, but it will be available to you. And then once you flush it, the tube sockets, just let the amp sit for like an hour just to make sure it all evaporates out before you apply power. And you can also use isopropyl alcohol in very small amounts on all the ribbon connectors on your amp, where all the cables go from the preamp board to the power board. Just disconnect it, clean this in, clean that in, put it back together, let it sit and put it back together. It could take you like 3 hours one Saturday night to do that, because you'd want to say, well, I'm going to label everything, I'm going to disconnect everything, I'm going to clean everything, I'm going to let it sit for an hour, then I'm going to put everything back. And all that kind of stuff can really help. If your JCM 2000 TSL 100 does develop definite issues with its power tube board, with its main board, which is very common in all of them, my buddy Brad at Brad's Guitar Garage, who's actually out of town right now, otherwise he would normally be here, he is offering, or soon will be offering, very high quality replacement boards for the DSL 100 and the TSL 100, made the way they should have. He's offering them either populated or unpopulated, and if you get the unpopulated, you get the parts list. You can order all the stuff and do it yourself. But he's not here to tell you more about that. He'll probably be here next week. So do what I just suggested first, because it's cheap. Some inexpensive isopropyl alcohol and some time might solve all your problems. But the big fix is going to be on the horizon soon. Thank you for the super chat, Dale's Guitar Tuition. Bottom Kitchen just got a Fender Electric Vibrolux Reverb. Amazing condition. Amp was dead quiet until I can eat it. I pulled the chassis to check out the guts. Now a slight hiss. Any ideas what it may have? Is it back in the chassis? Is it back in the amp, the cabinet, and everything tight, and it's still noisy? Because what often happens is... No, Jim Cox, the same board is used for the TSL and the DSL. Depends on how you populate it. Brad's got the board built to do everything. All right. If you put everything back, is it all the way tight? Because the inside top of a Fender cabinet has got that wire mesh. And if you have the chassis in place, but it's not all screwed together, that wire mesh is like this far from the top of the chassis, but it's not touching it, so it's not shielding it. It acts like a capacitor. You get noise, and that whole thing needs to be really tight. It's also possible that there's some tarnish, on that metal mesh or on the sides of the chassis. So just make sure everything is clean before you put it back together. But if the only thing you did was take the chassis out and put it back, and you have a hiss that wasn't there before, that doesn't make any sense unless you moved wires. Yeah, you might have moved some wires inside, and that can make a difference. I show in the video that's going to be coming out soon on this blues breaker how just moving a wire can dramatically lower the noise floor in an amp. It's got to be something fairly simple, though. Yeah, thanks, Alex. Most of the AC30 sounds I've heard have been terrible. They're either really saturated, like bad Queen copies, or so anemically clean and thin and bright that I can't imagine a useful use for them, a purpose for them. I've not heard all of the ones out there, but it's like this very exaggerated concept of what an AC30 should sound like rather than what an AC30 does sound like. If someone gets an AC30 in and they're getting it in for the purpose of capturing it so they can sell an AC30 capture, they may not know how to set the damn thing. It's really easy to get bad sounds out of an AC30. So I'm pretty good at it. So my captures will not be commercially available, though, because they're not going to, unless I make it from an amp that I personally own. It'd be unethical for me to then sell it, unless a client were to give permission. But I don't see myself setting up the account to get paid for that. I might give it out to people I love. So be nice to me. But then you could not sell it because I would find you, and I would no longer like you, and you would cry. Hey, Adam Shaw. He's got a Fender Hot Rod Deluxe. Is there a risk of damage to the amp if the original filter caps fail? Yeah. Most commonly, they will arc. When they fail, they draw a lot of current and they get hot. Very, very commonly. When they get hot, they break the little cheap solder joint where the leads join the board, the trace, the pad, because it's a very small amount of lead-free wave soldering typically. And once that breaks, but it still has voltage there, then every time it vibrates, it arcs. And when it arcs, it burns. And when it burns, you lose little chunks of metal that used to be the pad or the trace. In extreme circumstances, it'll literally burn the board. So given that there aren't a lot of filter caps in a Hot Rod Deluxe, go ahead and change them. I'm talking $10, $15 worth of caps. Take you an hour and a half to do it, and the amp's going to sound better because even if the old ones haven't begun to spew their guts or are short or anything, that they're not going to be working as well as a high-quality capacitor. Wow, that Junior. Anywhere else hear that chorus of angels when it came into frame? Well, let's take a look at this thing, shall we? Let's make sure I don't stick this into my speakers. So you can see there, or maybe you can't, but it's got the original pots, changed out cap. It's been refinned, you can tell. It's got almost a satin finish to it. Rear cover is not original, and it's got shielded paint on the back of it, but there's no shielding in the cavities, so I'm not sure what was up with that. It's got changed out tuners, though they've been aged. The original tuners are in the case. It's got a changed out bone nut that's a little bit not cut well on the D and G. They need to have more of an angle towards the string behind the witness point, and they're a little bit tight. I put some nut sauce on this. So it plays in tune fairly well right now because it was going really sharp on the D and G if I breathed on it. But these are 10 through 46. I think these slots might have been cut for 9s. And I told the owner that I do not feel that I am the guy to make big changes on a 59 Junior because I don't want to take a chance of any of my tools slipping and marring anything. Leave that to an actual professional. But I know that he either needs to go to 9s or the D and G slots need to be slightly widened. The nut was cut really well as far as string height. I mean, there's almost no movement at the first fret when I fret at the third. So, I mean, that's why I think it might have been cut for 9s and now has 10s on it because everything else about it was really well done. There's a bit of a gap between the bushings on the tuners and the headstock. I would want to have that looked at to make sure we're not putting any undue pressure on the headstock. The headstock has never, as far as I can tell, broken off. If so, it was done truly invisibly. I don't see any sign of it, and I can see the pores and the grain here. Sadly, when it was refinished, the serial number was gone. Has the original pickup, which is the reason to be here. The original bridge is in the case. This is one Glazer in Nashville makes, an intonated one. And the issue I'm having is that it sounds and plays great down here. But up here, it frets out. And I don't think it's a case of uneven frets. I think this needs to come up some more. The bridge needs to come up some more. I raised it a little bit before doing this video today because I want to sneak up on it. I don't want to go in there and start making big changes. And it's still quite low action up here. It probably just needs to come up another fraction. But you can hear it buzzing there. So there is a high or low fret as well. right there at the 17th fret. I'm not sure if you can hear the strings. But all that stuff, this thing does in spades, and this is, I'm going to be using this to test out this blues breaker for sure. Oh, and the pick guard is non-original. In fact, it was cut improperly right here, which is very slightly affecting the way the pickup sits. I'll talk to the owner about that. But it sounds great, and below the 12th fret, it's a monster. I'd like all the frets to be monstrous. Let's see. Hey, Vibrolux is one of my favorite amps in the world, and people think of me as being a Vox guy. I think I am a Vox guy. I'm also a Vibrolux guy. I'm also a Marshall guy. The AC10C1 I don't think is a good representation of the Vox sound. I famously have some big issues with that model. If it works for you, I'm glad for you, but they're gonna become problematic at an accelerated pace. And the 65 Vibrolux is such a much better built amp. So yeah. Let's see. I don't know anything about Randall Smith and Gibson and the circumstances. I don't care that much. I'm also not going to make videos about Jane's Addiction fighting. People are like, it's shocking incident. I'm like, Jane's Addiction, nothing is shocking. What are my thoughts and opinions on early Silverface Fenders? Just add a 71 Princeton reverb to your arsenal. They're fantastic. Fantastic. In 72, they went from a screwed-on baffle to a glued-in dado baffle. And then later they went to a baffle which is separate from the grill cloth. The grill cloth was on a Velcroed-on frame. Those are not as good. And the glued-in baffles are not as good as the screwed-on baffles. But electronically, there's nothing wrong with the later 70s stuff. And the early 70s, like 71, is the same. And then at some point in 73, they started putting way too much wax on the boards. So it's harder to make them get back to where they ought to be. But 68 through 71 is just phenomenal for usually a lot less than the 63 to 68 or 67. I guess 67 is the changeover period. 71 is great, and in my case, it would be a birth year. So if you get tired of it, send it to me. Hey, Patrick, thank you very much. I guess you're talking to Mark. I'm sorry. But yeah, Top Hat makes really good stuff, and Brian loves what he does, and he's fun to talk to about amps. If you were talking to me, my name's Lyle, but oh, hi, Mark. I did not hit her. I did not. Safe wattage set of speakers for a twin reverb, and how to determine the wattage given us a 2-speaker amp of the channel. Gary McKinney. In general, a twin reverb is best thought of as technically 85, but think of it as a 100-watt amp. There are two ways to think about it. If you're, you would want to have 50% more than that. So you want 150 watts handling typically. So that would tell you two 75-watt speakers. But that's the safest option, the very safest option. In general, people aren't playing a twin reverb on 7. If you are, then you might want to go to a 4x12. Most people are playing a twin reverb on 3 or 4. So you can take that 85 watts, which is nominal for that amp, more seriously. And so if you were to say, well, let's go for about 120 watts, typical 130 watts, 265 watt speakers will get you there. And they're going to be a great choice. Now, the old Jensen C12Ns were not even rated for that. So that they were being pushed kind of hard. But if you want safety, a for a twin reverb, I recommend and have installed multiple times 65-watt speakers, and I think that is a good trade-off. But you can use two 40-watt speakers, and that's fine. But you just know that you do have a lower margin of safety. But it might be worthwhile to you for the tone. They're always tonal versus reliable. Sometimes there's a little bit of a trade-off there. If you're not comfortable or informed, if you're not really informed on this already, or you absolutely cannot afford to have something go wrong, go with two 65-watt or higher speakers, and you won't regret it. I don't have a recommendation, Matt, on a good refinisher, but I know someone will, so I'll be looking for that. Yeah, Matt Fields. The master volumes typically came in later, but yeah, that the screwed on baffle is not a deal breaker for me, but it would, especially since the price on silver faces are going up. That would be something I would really want. Otherwise, I'd be like, well, I'm going to have to get a Mojitone replacement cabinet for it eventually, because the baffle boards that Fender was using were masonite, basically. I mean, the particle board, and if they get any moisture at all, they warp and they fall apart and they crumble. And when it's the glued in dado, it's just a lot of problems in the future on those. And they can't always hold the weight. You know, you'll get an amp like that someone put JBLs in, and the JBL weight physically destroys the old fake wood baffles. Let's see. Any ideas how to utilize that unhalf 12x7 on a basement Bambuel? Well, there are three ways to do it. You can leave it alone. You can connect all three pins of the unused triode to ground, which will technically make the triode, which is in use, be a little bit quieter, and in theory last longer, though it doesn't. It seems to be much more theory than fact. And the quieter thing, I've tried it. It's slightly, maybe noticeable, not much. But the other thing you can do is you can go in and invent Dumbles and invent train wrecks from using that gain stage, because both the Dumble Overdrive Special and the train wreck came from, looky there, what can we do with that? Yeah, but the thing about Chris, is the software doesn't want hot signals at every step. It should not. They have changed it. In fact, with the last update, they used to have a built-in 8.5 or 8.6 dB gain increase after the AD converter, and that's been removed. And it needs to work with instrument level, straight out of the guitar. But the trouble is, so many of the guys out there doing captures have done captures where the capture is done with the gain turned way up. And so it doesn't sound right if you use it intelligently. Not that you're not using it intelligently, but there needs to be a systematic approach. And IK Multimedia seems to be insane with this. I mean, Line 6 gets it right, Neural gets it right, Fractal gets it right. There we have standard levels that all audio engineers understand how it works. And for them to be arbitrary about this and just all over the map, and then you get all these guys selling captures with varying degrees of knowledge, but hey, there are a lot of people making bad captures, selling them to people who don't know that they're bad captures, because there's no consistency. So I know and can measure the output level of these single coils versus this P90 versus the P90s in my casino versus the various humbuckers I have here. And I can measure all that, and I can calibrate all that. And I want an amp to react differently to my Strat than to my 335. That's the whole point of it. So when I plug into this deluxe reverb in real life with this Strat, and I got a clean sound, and I go to the SG there, it's dirtier. I like that, and a good capture will reflect that, but you have to have a baseline. And so all captures should be done so that if I were to plug this Strat into the Tonex with that capture loaded, with the levels at 0, it's the same as plugging into the amp that was captured. And that is just not a thing which exists in that world yet. I mean, Dustin here does live sound. He knows what I'm talking about. Levels are not suggestions. They're so critical. Sorry to get off on a rant, but it just seems so unprofessional of IK Multimedia to do this kind of thing. Yeah, Asheville, oh my God, yeah, I'm just catching up to where you guys were talking about that. It's very, very hard to watch. And let's remove one thing here. All right, I don't want to hear any anti-FEMA stuff here. I can't remove it in this part of the chat, but we're not going to go in that direction of a whole bunch of bullshit on this channel. Let's see. Unused tried in the basement is in V2 bass channel. Well, no, it depends on the basement. On other basements, it's a different tube. In 165, that affects both channels. Let's see. Sean Browning's got a Marshall build that seems to be oscillating with signal like a whine that messes with the tone, like taking from the headroom. Sounds amazing turned down, but when I start, turning it up, you got oscillation. You could have a bad ground connection. You could have bad lead dress. You could have something shielded, which unshielded, which should be shielded. There's just so many things that could cause that. Grounds are the biggest thing. I can have an amp that oscillates terribly, and I change the ground scheme, and all that goes away. So look at my video on ground schemes for Marshalls, and that really does fix a lot of oscillation. That and you can see where I use shielded wire and things. Pretty much anytime you're going to a grid very early in the circuit, proper shielding with the right cable that's not high capacitance is very beneficial. And then in some amps, it's nice to be able to have some mild snubber caps here and there, but on average Marshall builds, it's not necessary. Let's see. How do I fix the input so I can't give it too much input signal? If you're building an existing circuit and that circuit is a Marshall style that traditionally works, you don't need to fix the input. You need to double check everything that you did in there. And I'm sorry to be, I don't mean to sound dismissive, but 90% of the time when someone's building an amp, if they don't know everything that they're seeing just at the moment that they're seeing it, there's something that they've missed. Hey, Meryl, I will talk to you about amp mixing in person since you've got my phone number. I'm going to try to focus on the guys across the country, across the world, who this is their weekly shot, if that's okay with you, man. I think you understand. I don't know about what a tag board Marshall Tremolo 50 is worth because I don't keep up with the market. What do I think about new old stock valve tubes? I think they're great if you buy them from a reputable vendor, Gast. The trouble is there's so many guys out there selling them on eBay and Reverb and et cetera, and you just never know what you're going to get. So if you buy from a vendor that can actually test them, a tube vendor, that's what they do, who stand behind them, then it can be worth it. I don't think it always gives any real difference. Depends on where you're playing. If you're playing in a club and it's all noisy, once the hi-hats kick in, you may not hear any difference at all. But a pothole that will take out a $35 tube will also take out a $350 tube. So which would you rather risk on an average gig? Versus if you're going in the studio, it might be worth putting in really nice stuff for the studio and just babying it, because you might be able to get it heard in that case. And there's a lot of snake oil salesmen out there. And it's the age of the tube is not what makes someone sound great or play great versus not. For instance, Ace Frehley was using really nice tubes and really nice amps and still sounded like Ace Frehley. What's my opinion on the 2016 Marshall Silver Jubilee? I don't know for sure, because there have been a couple different versions of the Silver Jubilee, and I don't know what was offered in 2016. But the ones with the little green square pots I would avoid, because they are really prone to getting tin whiskers and shorting out oddly. And for the price that they charge for them, I don't think that amp is built well enough. But the 16 might be better. Yeah, the Lurks version, which is kind of a semi-tweaked version of that circuit, is much better built. And I'm not sure if the Lurks has all three modes of the 2550, 2525, etc. But it sure looks cool. Thank you, sent to me. Appreciate that. People talking about dishwashers and telling them about new old stock tubes. Let's see. No one shit talk Greta Thunberg. She's doing important work. Tube amps are not a problem for the world. There's so few of them. Anyway, don't confuse issues here, guys. Come on, Dustin. Not on my channel, man. Let's see. Should a solid pine improve the sound of my particle board 78 Princeton? Well, that's a total crapshoot, Antonio. Pine is a very resonant, soft wood, and you can have a pine cab that sounds great, and you have a pine cab that sounds terrible. And they're built exactly the same. There's a reason most guys who do this at some point want to just go to void-free birch plywood, because it's going to be consistent. Harmonicaster. I'm serious. I don't need all that on this channel, okay? Let's see. Where were we? I think we're right at the last break. What years are the best for PCB, JCM 800, 100 watt? Well, all of them were PCB, but 76, 77, whenever they started doing the full circuit, through 83 before they went to the vertical input, horizontal input rather. Harmonicaster. I am political. I make a living through science. So and I play music inspired by people who've. Well, the best way to put this: all the music I play that I love comes from Africa. Everything I do involves science. So yeah, it gets political sometimes, because that's how reality is. If you have a problem with that, there are other channels. Let's see. We're talking about coffee, Rush albums. Must be at the last intermission. Let's see. Thanks, sent to me. That's very kind of you. Ah, man, there's some. So hard not to react to bullshit sometimes. I lost where I was in the chat. This thing is so hard to keep up with. Sorry for the dead airspace. There we are. I don't know anything about AER amps. Sorry. I know that they exist and that they do primarily for acoustics, but I've not had any experience with them, Martin. Sorry. Oh, I'm glad you like your Pano Verb. I can't. If nothing else, the color scheme would make me never want to even have it in the house. I've seen some of the videos. None of them showcase it. They advertise it. None of them are reviews. There hasn't been a single review. I don't know how it's built. So it's a typical new product release from Fender, where 30 channels all have it come out. On the day that it's announced, all the videos come out at once. All these reviews. And I'm sure if they could, they'd have the acoustic sonic being plugged into it. Notice that all those guys doing the reviews of the Pano Verb used to do really great reviews of the acoustic sonic, but now when they do the Pano Verb, not a single one of them is plugging that acoustic sonic into it. So what happened there? Hey, Don Spencer. Yeah, that Looper video was tough. I was certainly not lecturing anyone. That's Joe. Joe's the guy who can do that. But, it is so hard just to do a 4 or 8 bar loop and have it line up when it comes around so you can play across it. Because people, unless you're playing to a metronome or a click track or anything, our internal click floats around so much. And for Joe to sit there and do a 12 bar, 16 bar, and longer loop and have the one come around, that's a practice goal right there. So I thought I'd throw that on there for people just to have a think about. I've played Fender style amps with a 10, 15, or 10, 20, 12. None of the things in the Pano Verb seemed unusual to me. A neat combination of things. If it's built well, I don't think it can be built well for $3,000. And it's just so ugly with all the yellow. It's like it has no. It shits on Fender's visual language. Let's just put it that way. These things matter to me. I don't. My thought on Orange Rocker Verb 100 Mark II. Are they noisy? They're not really noisy. They are fine designs. They're unusual designs. I don't find them noisy. I don't like them very much myself subjectively, but objectively they're fine. The problem I have with the Oranges is that they use really cheap pot metal pots. By pot metal, for those of you who aren't from America, I mean powdered metal that's really malleable, that breaks, and they use really long split shaft pot shafts, but they have set screw knobs which just compress the long shafts of the pots, and then they break, and then the knob and the pot go off because that metal, you can almost press it in with your thumbnail. And to replace that pot, you've got to find another one that fits the same because it's the only one that takes that knob, and it's just a really cheap pot to use in a $2,000 amplifier. Hey, Tony Flaminiu. I drink Maxwell House French roast most of the time. They're the brands I prefer, but they tend to be very expensive. And you know, if if uh, if I could have nothing but certain community coffee blends, I would. But that would quadruple my coffee budget, and I drink a lot of coffee. So Maxwell House French roast, made to the right temperatures for me. Yeah, Chris R. Fletcher Munchin is very important for all the things that I try to communicate here, but it's not just perception of frequency ratios, but and mids versus treble bass. It's also if a sound has a little bit of distortion to it, if a sound has some compression artifacts that we subjectively, our subconscious mind picks up on that, even if we don't say, "Oh, that's compressed." We hear it as a loud source, a loud, exciting thing, even if it's not being played back at a loud level because it has the attributes of a loud sound. It comes from the part of our brain that is hardwired to listen for bears and tigers. Hey, that's exciting. That might be dangerous. I got my focus immediately. And that used to only happen acoustically at loud volumes, but now we can make things have that at lower volumes, and it still gets our interest. And that's why it's tricky to pull off without it being artificial. And I'm not talking about running everything through a old, what's it called, the red stomp thing, any compressor. I can't even think today. I'm still underwater with a sinus thing. Let's see. What are my takes on flyback diodes for an 800 volt B plus, the class B amp drawing 200 watts from before? I would use R5000s or two R3000s in series. That's what I would do. Thanks for all the tips to help make my 72 Pro reverb quieter than I ever thought possible. Hey, very glad to help. Nous sommes là. So very good. But yeah, if you're doing that much voltage, you want to have a little bit more capability. Dynacomp, thank you, Ramalama Ding Dong. I love that I get to say sentences like, thank you, Ramalama Ding Dong. I want to have quite a bit of capability there, so some R5000s ought to do it, and certainly be very necessary. Hey, good at guitars. I change tips about once a year, but I've got that iron now that shuts itself off after a while. So, it's not constantly on. So I'm probably extending its life by a few years. I'm going to take this question from Harmonicaster because I think that he and I crossed wires later in the chat. And I think if we were to talk about things in person, it'd be fine. But he gave me a super chat and a question, so I don't want to be like, fuck that guy, he disagreed with me. Now, let's talk about this stuff. So 250, an audio taper, 250K pickup volume pot, was acting more like an on-off switch in the first 30% of travel. An audio taper 100K works much smoother. Does that make sense? Yes, and I'll tell you why. Because the way pots are built these days, it is not the value that's going to be affecting that, because that's going to be a voltage divider with a certain taper. But because the way pots are made today, they have different track dimensions. And so some tracks, like the 500K and 1 meg CTS pots, there actually is almost no track left from 0 to what would be about 8:30, 9 o'clock, because they use that same track in the pots where it's switched off. So it just shuts off at the lower part of the range. But As far as how the volume works, you have a pickup, which is an inductor, but for our purposes, let's call it a resistor, and say you've got a 6K pot, a 6K strat pickup, and it goes to the input of a volume pot, and let's say it's 250K, it's 250K to ground, and it's got the wiper, and so that's a voltage divider, but it's always got a 250K to ground hanging off that pot. So 250K in parallel with 6K, let's say you're at 5K. I don't know what the math is for that, top of my head. Change it to 100K, it's going to go down from 5K to 4.5K. So it's not a huge difference on the parallel value of that, the DCR parallel value of that pickup to the pot. So the 100K versus 250K makes a difference. It does load the pickup to different amounts, and with the inductance gets a little complicated, but essentially there's not a huge difference in the load between 100K and 250K. And the taper, the voltage divider, is not going to be that noticeable because you're not losing that much level going to the 100K pot. So especially since you're going to have more of an on-off with 250K, you'd think if it was the value of the pot that you'd have more of an on-off effect at 100K because the volume gets really low. So it is the actual physical construction of the potentiometer. And if you were to take a Burns 250K pot, a CTS 250K pot, and an Alpha 250K pot, all measured to be 250K, or all measured to be 247K, whatever, and they all say audio taper, they're all going to have a different behavior in that range. So it's really hard to track all this down. When you start building apps and stuff, you have to figure all this stuff out. And sometimes you've got to buy one of everything on the market and just do tests and draw out the responses. It's time to take our second 7-minute intermission. I'm going to reset my old one. And we're going to do this again. 7-minute intermission. See everyone later. See you, Andy, 1966, and I'll see you guys in 7 minutes. And something I meant to mention a minute ago was if you have a volume pot that's acting like an on-off switch, try a J taper. Tone sells them as vintage taper. Much, much better response for guitar use. Let's see, Strum Bum. I didn't mean to scare the absolute shit out of you. Boom. Strum Bum says that converting a silverface to blackface specs on a deluxe reverb or a Princeton reverb includes swapping rectifier tubes. You can use a 5U4. Just bias it. One of the nice things you can do with any old 60s Fender AB763 that came with a GZ34, which was designed for lower wall voltages than we have today, you stick a 5U4 GB in, and with 120 volts coming out of the wall, you can have a B plus much closer to how it would have been in 1964 with the GZ34. You still have to watch your heater voltages, but either are fine to use, whichever one if you notice a difference at all, just make sure that you bias it accordingly. And good at guitars, I figured out the question mark. I change tips about once a year. K2 says, sing 5 volts up and 10 volts down after first gain stage on my 67 AA864. Any usual suspects? I'm not sure you mean by 5 volts up and 10 volts down. Can you elaborate on that? What's the point of decaf goody guitars? I don't understand it. Let's see. Let's see. Evening from Bowdoin. 50 miles from the Arctic Circle. Picked up that AC15C1, all good, but reverb is very weak. That is usually a reverb tank issue. Alan, the circuit for the reverb in that is solid state and is very, very reliable. The trouble is they ship with absolute terrible Belton Accutronic tanks, the same ones that Fender uses in their reissues. So I don't know why these major companies use these majorly bad, cheap reverb tanks. And the issue is that they're cheap in terms of build quality and reliability. They cost the same as a good one. So order up an MOD or Mojo Tone version, and you'll be very, very much happier. If you're in Europe, you may want to get it from Tube Amp Doctor. And I'm sorry, I can't make out the flag there. Is that Norway? So Tube Amp Doctor might be better for you. And you want the E series. They'll have the same number on the TAD tank as what you have on the stock Belton Accutronics. You might be able to get a Ruby branded tank as well, but I'm pretty sure that Tube Amp Doctor would be the easiest one to get in Europe. Let's see. Yeah, that's the thing it kills me, is that there's so much bad information out there. Not just bad information, there's deliberate misinformation with all the YouTube review channels, because they never say anything bad, never say anything negative. And on one level, I can respect that, hey, I only review stuff I like, so if I didn't like it, I didn't do a review. But how useful are you as a source of reviews at that point? And no one judges it on the quality of the damn thing. Unless it like physically catches on fire in front of them. They never even think about the quality or how long it's likely to last. I should not complain because it sends people to me as opposed to all the bigger channels out there. But I should not be the only one. I'm not the only one, but I should not be among the very, very few. And the big channels do not do this. Hey, Van Shank, thank you very much for the super chat. I have had a chance to work on a stage right amp from Monoprice. I have declined it out of deference to the owner. It is not worth. I charge $80 an hour. If an amp is worth $100, why? Why? I'm I'm sorry that they're building disposable things, but if you get an amp for the price of a speaker, you're not getting what you think you're getting. I see a fountain bird. I just the race to the bottom is very, very real. The trouble is, it's just going to be a race to fill the landfills. Someone was talking earlier about, hey, the government's not going to come for my amps. The government's not come for your amps. No one cares that you've got an old Fender that draws more power than a TV. That's not a thing. But what is a thing is that we live in the era of disposable electronics. And I'm guilty of it. This remote's going to fail. This Tonex is going to fail. These phone charger power banks are going to fail, and they're all going to end up at some point in landfill. And iPad, computer screen, Motu M2. There are things which have a finite life, and we hope for the best. But when it comes to guitar amps, when the standard is Fenders and Marshalls that have been around since the 50s and 60s and are still working fine with some TLC, and then you get an amp that you pay $100, $200 for from Monoprice from China, it's not worth fixing. And it's going to fail because it is not built to any quality standard whatsoever. It is just a short trip to the recycling, not even to the recycling, just to the landfill, and that's a problem. If you have one and you like the sound, great. I'm not saying you're stupid. I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm saying enjoy it while it lasts. Oh, man, you got slide pots. That's fun. You got a slide pot. Those tapers can also be really, really rough. Depends on how it's being used. If it's being used in a guitar, where it's the pot's in parallel with a pickup, you have a certain selection. But if it's being used in a circuit, typically after a coupling cap, if you need to have the value of the pot, you can double the value of the cap and end up with the same frequency response. I don't know how it's being used in the circuit, but if you can find a burn, if you like the taper of the A100K burn, if you can find the same burn in 250K, you might be better off. Or you can also cut the trace from the bottom to ground and put in a fixed resistor and say this is going to be my fixed minimum. So if you're always using 75% of the range and you don't care about the bottom 25%, you can just have that fixed. So it's always going to go to a fixed minimum. You can do that. You could maybe get the 250K to work, but you have to measure where you're at. But maybe if you put like a 10K resistor where it's from its bottom to ground instead of going to ground, you might get the taper back that you're looking for without that cutoff. I chose 10K arbitrarily. A 250K audio taper pot, if it's true audio taper pot, it's going to be at 25K at noon. So depending on where it cuts out, you may be looking at 10K, maybe looking at 5K. I don't know. Play around with it. Everclear works fine, but it can be a little bit harsh on plastics compared to isopropyl. Deoxit I only use for cleaning electrical contacts, but I don't use it in any place like a tube socket where it can be conductive, because deoxit can form a film that can build up. So I will rarely use deoxit to do a very deep clean on a tube socket, but then I'll flush the deoxit out with isopropyl because I want metal to metal contact. I don't want metal to film to metal contact, because that film will trap dust and eventually you can have conductive issues in a socket. Let's see. Let's see, get into the next question. Remember, guys, if you can put some question marks before your questions, it helps me see them. Because at this point in the chat, there's a lot of guys talking to each other. It's hard to keep up with things. Hey, Ramalama Ding Dong. When people use an ISO-cab as load only on a tube amp in lieu of a load box, what is the point? Are they using a second speaker output to a DAW or something similar? It depends on what they're doing. Maybe they're using a line out, like an effects loop send to go to something, but they need to have a load there. And if they don't have a good reactive load, then it makes sense to connect it to an ISO cab, even if they're not miking it. But I don't know what specific circumstance you're describing. You would, if you use a second speaker output to a DAW, that second speaker output would have to go to a reactive load of some sort, in which case you may not need to have the ISO box as well. Or they may be doing an ISO box so they can have a mic and a direct, in which case there are ways around it. You can, if you were to do, you could do one output, speaker output to the ISO box and the other speaker output to something which just gives you a line level signal without being a load. And that would work because the amp would have the load. And so that would be a safe way to get a line out. The line outs rarely sound very good in comparison to a speaker. Let's see. People talking about when I was holding up the Junior. Yeah, that shielding on the inside of this does nothing. This is just nothing. A little bit of stray metallic substance not connected to anything. It's not offering any shield. It has to have continuity to ground. Otherwise, in fact, it can form a capacitor, and it's not going to in this case. Let's see. Thank you for rephrasing that as a super chat, but I already answered it. But thank you very much. Clean playing. Gotcha, did Amnesia. Okay. Short JFET, yeah. It's a good... The DSL and TSL 100 series amps from Marshall, the JCM 2000s, are great ways to learn how not to design an amp if you're willing to go in there. On those, watch out. There's a little cap if you're looking at the board from the top. And so the knobs are all facing away from you. The power tube to the bottom left, the leftmost power tube, there's a little cap there at I'm C26, I want to say. I may not be. But there's a little cap on the very left, and it's between the screen and plate, because you need a cap between the screen and the plate of those tubes. My God. And that's in a lot of the earlier ones, it's a 500 picofarad, 500 volt cap, and those things short and burn up. You can just remove it, or if you want to maintain the thing, you put in a 1K or 2K cap, and it works as designed. But that's a common point of failure for those apps. It doesn't seem like it's a problem in your situation, but something to be aware of on those. Sorry, I should put that up there for Mickey Louder to put that up there. Let's see. The bridge on this Junior, Dustin, really intonates well. The issue is that it can't bend above about the 13th fret, so I need to play around with it a bit more. See if I can give it back better than I got it. Let's see. Glad you enjoyed the Jane's Addiction reference, Gast. Yeah, it would be so easy for me to do videos like everyone else does. Like, oh, what do I think about the Jane's Addiction thing? Well, I think Perry Farrell's a drug-addled lunatic, and he always has been. That's his brand. What do I think about dude at Mesa getting fired from Gibson? I don't know if he was fired or if he had a contract expire or whether they just wanted publicity. But I don't know any of these things. I know exactly as much about these things as you guys do. I don't need to do videos on it just to get clicks. I'll do videos about either things I know really well or things that interest me that no one wants to know about, like how I make videos. Just Drives says, as an owner of a VibroChamp reverb amp, I can attest that it's absolutely garbage. I am sorry. I did try to warn people. It would have been a much better amp if they had skipped the entire reverb implementation, because it's not a very good sounding reverb. Get rid of that and put a real speaker in there. They could have had something. Any thoughts on Victory amps? I've only had a few. I've had a Duchess, I believe, and another amp which looked just like the Duchess but was something else. I mentioned this in the Amps Under $1,000 video. They're good amps. They're going to have. They're probably going to have much higher repair costs than otherwise, because they have so much crammed in such a small space. You have to take everything apart to do anything typically. And so you're going to have a much higher cost of repair than you would in a larger amp where you could reach things better. But before they fail, and I'm not saying that they're especially prone to fail, they are going to be very good sounding amps. They're really, given the size constraints, they're well built. They sound good. They do an awful lot. If it works for you, it works for you. I don't much think about I don't like the Lunchbox as a format, but they are miles better than, like, say, the Vox Night Train series was as in terms of being a Lunchbox amp. But Lunchbox amps, the screws always wear out where they hold the shell to the top, and they've got relatively thin side walls with threads, and those threads strip, and you're left with a rattly, noisy thing. It's really hard to change tubes in. Imagine trying to do that on a gig. So I think it's kind of a marketing visual aesthetic that doesn't always work well for its actual intended purpose. But not all Victories are Lunchboxes. So let's see. Oh, the Marshall 74X Combo RJ Electric. Yeah, that's a great amp. I have not had one of the reissues in, so I don't know how well they're doing on the reissues. But it is a really, really nice amp in real form. Let's see. Let's see. Well, 2 dB boost for neural amps, Tom, that's actually the level that they want. And that's fine because they tell you what that level is, and it's consistent for all the neural stuff. So if you get the neural system and you get neural captures, they're all referenced to that. So you take your guitar input and you give it a 2.8 dB boost, you're at where it wants to be. And other things are, the nominal is negative 12.2. And that is pretty much what a guitar into an interface gives you. That's pretty much what the output of a Strat is. And so if that's the thing, where you're at, and neural's 2.8 dB above that. It's just that there is no published number for what the standard is for the IK multimedia stuff. That, and there's a difference between what it wants for the amplitude stuff versus the Tonex stuff. I don't know if there's a difference between the Tonex and the Tonex 1. And there seems to be a marked difference between what the Tonex software wants versus what the Tonex pedal wants, even though you're supposed to be able to use the same captures on each and the same presets on each. It makes it really hard to dial in when it sounds one way as a plug-in in Logic or the standalone in the computer versus the same stuff loaded into the same thing. They really need to get their game together and the documentation and say, hey, we really messed up as we came out, but thank you for bearing with us. And if you just set it so, it's negative 12.2 or 3 dB above that, whatever, as long as they publish something, an actual target to hit that's specific and consistent, everyone can move forward from a much better place and make sure that the plug-in and the pedal version give the same result with the same input. And I know a lot of guys are like, well, just plug and play, man. Just who cares about all these numbers things? Just get a sound and play. I'm like, well, that's not quite how any of this works. It works fine if it's Hot Rod DeVille or whatever. But there's a bit more to it than that. If you want to A, sound good with all this stuff. B, sound the same on the Friday night gig as you did on the Saturday night gig. Richard Clark, you don't give money to FEMA. FEMA's already funded through taxes. Saying if you're going to give donations, the Red Cross have had a lot of issues with only a certain percentage making it to the actual people who need it. And there are a lot of other charities out there to look at. And I'm not saying Red Cross bad, this other thing good. I'm saying look into it. But FEMA, but bringing up FEMA, it just seems political for the sake of bad talking something. But FEMA is not something you donate to. You know, I don't want to get too far down this, but come on, guys, just there's so much misinformation right now about that subject, and I'm not going to be a broadcast source for that misinformation. The guitar is Spanish. Well, with all respect, you need to look more into the history of Spain. Let's see. Did something counterintuitive, Michael Smith says. Put a 10-inch speaker into a silver-faced deluxe reverb. Tried 3 or 4 different 12 inches. Bass response is great. I think the dimensions of the cab suit a 10. I can see that. Because it'd be a very large set of dimensions for a 10-inch cabinet. Yeah, be changing baffles to do that. Richard Clark, I'm not trying to be mean to you or anything. I just see so much stuff happening right now, which is not helpful. And I'm not saying you're doing that. That let's just not be part of the problem that's out there right now. I'm not talking about banjos and guitars. I'm talking about the music, where the music comes from that I listen to, that I love, that has made my life better, and is all from Africa and people from African descent. So yeah, I cannot not acknowledge that. I mean, how can any racist exist after listening to John Coltrane? My God. What would cause a tremolo to turn on by itself on a super reverb? Happens once in a while or the first couple minutes after power up. Well, you'd have to have the tremolo speed and intensity up. Beyond that, if it were to come on when you thought it was off, you'd have to have a faulty ground connection. So check your foot switch connections, and maybe a faulty foot switch. Let's see. Scrolling down to more questions. When are you going to see more pictures of my trip to England? I'll have to do something along those lines, Martin. I started to do a video on it, and it was just too much. Maybe I'll do I'll just share my photos saying we'll do a live stream just for that when people who would want to know. I don't want to bore people too much, but I do love talking about it. And, I could do a big thing saying why London is better than Paris. Maybe that would get some clicks. What's so special about a CE 2020 cap and a Princeton Reaper that makes it worth $60? Doug Romero says. Well, I don't know where you're paying $60 for it. I pay about $35 for that cap. And what's so special about it is that it is only used by it's supply and demand. They're the only supply. There's not a tremendous amount of demand, so they don't sell that much of them, but they got to make them, and so there's a high cost. But $60, C distribution 2020 450 or 525 volt cap can cap. It's about $35. All right, now when I came back from the last break, do I have expertise in old Oxford speakers? Well, I've heard an awful lot of them, but I'm not a big fan of them. They sound very, very mid-rangey. I mean, they do have good voice coils, but in small magnets. But I find that they have very mid-rangey sounds. I'm not a huge fan of them, but I am not a collector, compiler of minutia. Hey, JDS, completely restored your 77 Fender Champ, but you're still getting crackling, sizzling sounds when amp is cold started. Well, then you haven't completely restored it yet. What should I look at next? Well, here's one of the things. Try this. Jumper the power switch so it's always on, and then power it on by plugging it into the wall. See if you still get the crackling, sizzling sounds. If not, you might have a faulty power switch. I'd look there, but beyond that, if you've changed out all the caps and bad resistors and tubes and wax, there's just not much left to it unless you might have oxidation in your tube sockets, especially the output tube sockets. Then the next thing to do is pull one preamp tube at a time, let it cool off, and do a cold start and see if you can narrow it down to a tube socket, or just clean all the tube sockets and make sure that all the pins, especially in the octal sockets, are actually going to be applying pressure to the power tube pins. Hey, Doug, thank you. Doug hates the look of orange glop caps on a board. What would I use instead? Well, you're going to be upset. I've got a whole bunch of orange caps in this JTM45, as you can see in the thumbnail for this, but they're not orange drops. They're a small Vichy orange cap. I don't think you need to look at the color of a capacitor. The things that I look at are, first of all, the voltage rating and actual capacitance. Second of all, I'm looking for something which fits the board. I don't want to use a radial where an axial is better. I don't want to use an axial where a radial would be better. I don't want to use something that is so physically large that it's not going to be supported or it's going to put strain on things. I don't want to use, in a PCB amp, something where the lead is larger in diameter than the hole to accept that lead. I like, say, between the Vichy MKT 1813s that I use a lot and the more common Mallory 150Ms, they're both great choices and they sound fine. I think the Vichy is prettier, but that doesn't matter once it's working. The thing I like about the Vichy better is that the lead diameter is thicker and holds its shape better, and I feel that it secures the capacitor physically better than the thinner, more flexible leads on the Mallory 150Ms. But there might be a case where the 150M, because it does have a smaller lead, might fit through a hole in a board that the MKT would not, in which case I'd happily use the 150M. There are a lot of choices out there. But if you notice, most of the time I'm using the MKTs because they work in almost every amp that comes in commonly. But if I have a PCB thing and it's all like 7.5 millimeter, 10 millimeter, 12 millimeter, 15 millimeter lead spacing for box caps, I will happily use WEMA And I tend to prefer polyester over polypropylene if I have the choice. Thank you very much for the compliment. Okay, K2 is talking about peak to peak, 15 volts on the sine wave going into the next grid. Okay. Well, it depends on what you're measuring. If you're measuring in a tone stack, your sine waves can be all crazy. Sometimes it's better to learn to measure white noise or pink noise, or to measure the output after of the stage after that. For whatever reason, tone stacks can do wonky things to sine waves, but you know, so it's asymmetrical. It's not so you're not describing something that is where your center is just moved off by 2.5 volts. You're talking about, and you can see the actual center line is staying here, and you're only getting half up to top, half low. That's odd. You might have a bad cap in your, if it's in a tone stack or if it's just a coupling cap. I need to know the circuit. That's really odd. I mean, you can get odd things in a tone stack measurement, but it's not usually going to be what you're describing there. Is there a tech in your town you could consult? Because that'd be something very easy to do in person. It's very difficult to do in this format. Glad to help, Tom. And I never liked saying, by the way, this amp isn't built well, or this amp is taking advantage. I don't take any pleasure from that. I don't wake up in the morning thinking, what amp company can I shit on? But, amps come in and I'm like, whoa, hey, good compared to what? Well, say it again. There's a 1965 Deluxe Reaper right there that looks fantastic and will work for the next, it's going to outlive me if people take care of it. It's possible to make a production amp that just lasts and lasts and lasts. And if something goes wrong, it's relatively easy to fix. But people are losing that concept of, can you repair it? How often will you need to repair it? How expensive will that repair be? Yeah, Chubam, the Mojo Tone tank is much better than the stock one that comes with Blues Juniors. Now, some Blues Juniors, more recent ones, have been coming with Ruby tanks instead of the Belton Accutronics. The Rubies aren't too bad. The Belton Accutronics are terrible, but the Mojo Tone tanks I find to be much better. But the Blues Junior, again, that is the 8 or 9 E series, not an 8 or 9 A series. So you have to make sure you get the right tank for Blues Junior. A good vendor will say, "Hey, this is the model we carry that works just fine there." At what point do I think parts will not be available for these older amps from the 60s and 70s? Well, I'm not sure. The transformers are one thing. A lot of companies make suitable transformers, even if it's not one-to-one. The axial electrolytics are the biggest thing because axiolytics are being phased out in favor of radials. And so the issue is on these old Fenders, primarily on old Fenders where everything's in the doghouse. I'm going to have to come up with a way to use radial caps in there without a huge expense. And I've got some ideas floating around my head. But in general, the tubes are the biggest ticking time bombs. So, and that's another argument against all these cheap disposable amps. Every B52 amp, that every Blues Junior, every monoprice amp, not only is a landfill in itself, and very problematic, each of them is wasting tubes. We have a finite supply of tubes. The tubes probably won't be made past another generation. We're going to have what we have. And so think of all the EL84s that could live on in a Vox AC30 that have gone to early untoneful graves and badly maintained Blues Juniors. Think of all the Chinese B52 and Bulgara amps that have killed available stock of 6L6s and EL34s that could have been used in a real amp someday. We are mismanaging our dwindling out, resources by wasting these things in absolute bits of garbage. And here we are, just doing it. Someone just bought another one right now. Oh, there goes another one. Gone. Hey, I can't pronounce your name, but I thank you for the super chat. Is 75 AC30s a fair bit quieter than it should be on all channels? A clean boost gets it back in the ballpark. Is it quieter than it ought to be, or is it quieter than it was? 75 AC30, depending on who made it, which model it is, will often lack the cathode bypass cap across the cathode for the top boost tube stage. That was something that Vox took out in '67 as it putting a 22 or 25 microfarad, 25 or 50 volt cap across that cathode. That gets back to the pre-67 gain level on the top boost channel. But if the entire amp has lost volume, you may have an issue with the. There are a lot of things it could be. But if it's not associated with any other noise or weird response, you may be biased wrong. You may have had a change in your bias resistor, which has drifted high. In a cathode bias amp, the larger the value, the larger the amount of resistance in its cathode resistor, the cooler the amp will run. So if you had, say, a 50 ohm or 80 ohm resistor originally, and that has drifted to 30% of its original, plus 30% of its original value, or plus 40% of its original value, then your amp will lose level and output at the same amount. May or may not be measurable. There are other things it could be. It could be a weak tube, and you may just need to try different preamp tubes. I don't want to give you too many rabbit holes to go down. I would start with, hey, this thing definitely used to be louder than it is now. I would start by trying a different 12X7 in different spots and seeing, hey, if that was it, that there it is. Second of all, making sure that the speaker cables are good, because sometimes you're losing power that way. Plug into another cab just in case you've got weak speakers. But those are the things to look at before you do anything, make any changes electronically. Hey, Luke, about to clean up a stock 5B3 Tweed Deluxe. Wow, that's old. 51 wants to install a handle and feet, but there are no holes in the cab. It's a 51. I think that would be a bad idea to make any changes to a 51 cab. If it came without a handle and feet, then that cab should stay that way. You could, for the intrinsic value to a collector of that amp, I would suggest having a replica cab made that chassis fits into, that has a handle and feet. It's possible that it used to have a handle and feet and someone recovered it in the past and covered them up. But I would look at that. That's when it gets into there's the utility of the thing versus the inherent value of the thing to a collector. And that can get very upside down. You know, the 5B3 is not nearly as good as the 5E3. But the 5E3 is not from 1951. It's not one of the very earliest Fenders made. So is tricky. I would proceed with caution. Thank you very much, Luke. I appreciate the super chat there. Let's see. Alex241, I have no experience with or knowledge of the Mark Tremonti Lunchbox amp. I'm terribly afraid that it would sound like Mark Tremonti, and that would not be a good thing. But you know, it's a lot of opinions out there. Thanks, Jeremy Watson. Appreciate that. The spec of cable I use in tube amp wiring. Well, most of in terms of the shielded stuff I use either Canary GS4 or some coax stuff I get. And whenever you see me do a shielded run like that, know that I'm doing a telescoped ground where the shield is only connected at one end to ground, the other end is floating. And I use heat shrink to make sure that no strands of wires can touch anything they should not. For the rest of the cable that I use, I typically use 22 gauge. If I'm restoring an old fender that had cloth-covered wire, I'll use cloth-covered pushback solid core wire. Left to my own devices, my preference is for Teflon-coated 20 gauge because I like the way it dresses. You can really steer it, and it stays where you want it, kind of like solid core, but it doesn't develop microphonics or brittleness like solid core. And in a Marshall style thing, like when you see the insides of this amp in more depth soon, that's all 22 gauge top coat Marshall style that I get from Valve Storm. So I get that wire from Valve Storm. I get the Teflon stuff from Tube Depot and other places like that. And the cloth covered stuff, I like what Doug Hoffman sells. And for the shielded stuff, I buy in bulk from Apex Junior, or I'll buy the Canary GS4 from Regco. Thank you very much, Alan Harvey. I appreciate that. That's very kind of you. Okay, we're gonna be wrapping up. If there's questions I have not gotten to, well, I'll do this again. Thank you very much. Yeah, all right. I'll look into Samaritan's Purse, Colby Jack. Thank you for that recommendation. Yeah, I just want as much of the funds to get to the people who need it as possible, and the Red Cross has had some iffy track records on that. And I did not mean for that to open a political shitstorm. The green cap size replace those two white ceramics. They're not caps, they're resistors, Doug Romero. I'm replacing resistors. I'm using some Vishay low mass 5 watt 470 ohms. But if you're calling them caps, I think you're not quite at the point where you're ready to start doing that kind of work yourself. You need to learn the difference between capacitors and resistors. And I am legitimately not being mean, but the inside of a valve amp with high voltage is not the place to learn. You learn all this inside pedals that work off a 9-volt battery, where you can't hurt yourself, you can't kill yourself, nothing's likely to catch on fire, and if you burn something, you're not out hundreds and hundreds of dollars. So get all your stuff together, working on pedals, and then work up towards amps, because there's no second chances. There's no player two with amplifiers. If you mess up, it can have real consequences. So learn all these things on your own time, at your own pace, in a safe environment. Build guitar pedals. There's so many kits out there. Start with a simple fuzz face or something, and you might really enjoy it. And if you're not careful, you might learn something. Okay. You got it. It's a Dallas. Okay. I wish I could figure out how to pronounce your username. The top boost cathode was cap indeed missing. Stephen didn't catch that. That's odd. He's really good at this. Maybe he just was. Maybe he was just looking for something else. Okay, so he recently serviced the amp and couldn't figure out what's going on with it, why it's lower in output. So that's separate from the missing cathode bypass. I wish I could say, well, send it to me. But if you just had Stephen work on it, it is not close to me. Come back next Saturday, and we'll talk some other things on that. But be sure that all your tubes are good. It doesn't happen very often, but I have had it happen where I'll have more than 1 weak tube in an amp, and so you swap V1 to V2, and the sound doesn't get better. Sometimes you take a new tube, put it in V1, it still sounds weak. Take a new tube, put it in V2, but the original back in V1 still sounds weak. Sometimes you've got to full set of new tubes to make sure that, because you can have a bottleneck anywhere, and you can have multiple instances of bad tubes in an amp. But I imagine if you could write down all the voltages at all the plates and cathodes of all the preamp tubes and the plates and screens on the output tubes and get that information to me next week, we might be able to get you somewhere. let's see. All right, yeah. All right, I think it's time to end, and I really appreciate everyone being here. And I'm sorry if I sounded, if I offended anyone with my insistence on respecting science and wanting this channel to be only full of accurate information and to avoid the political hot potatoes of the week. But again, it is my channel, my rules. That's how we roll.